kick things off with Tenacious Tutelage, tips for koha training with Michael Adamyk.
Hi everyone, my name is Michael Adamyk and I work for the Central Kansas Library System. And one of the biggest parts of my job is managing a consortial koha catalog for 54 libraries. And a big part of that is training libraries on how they can learn how to use koha and how they can help their patrons use it as well. Now, I'm not going to actually focus too much on technical aspects of koha. I'm going to take a bigger picture view, step back, and look at how you can improve at training in general. It will apply to koha as well as some other things. I know this is a koha conference, but I'm bending the rules a little bit. Before we get started, I want to ask you a couple of questions. So if you just raise your hands, how many of you feel a bit nervous at the idea of training or teaching someone else? Okay. How many of you have ever been really frustrated when you're trying to learn something new, or you've been trying to help someone else learn something new and they're just really frustrated? Yeah. How about this? How many of you have felt like you're inadequate or maybe a bit of an imposter at work? Gotcha. Well, I want you to know that we're going to touch on all those things a little bit today. First of all, a little bit about me. So I'm not actually a formally educated teacher or trainer. I've been training for several years. And for most of my life, I've been painfully shy from about 5 or 6 up until a few years ago. And I started working in an academic library after graduating college. It was a very small academic library, and there weren't a lot of people. It was very calm, very quiet, and it was comfortable, but I wasn't really growing that much. And so about 6 years ago, about 6 years ago, I stepped out of the academic library world and into the public library world. And many of you know the public library world is a whole different animal than the academic library. So it was a bit of a culture shock. But one of the biggest things that surprised me, that was difficult for me, was answering the darn telephone. I'm serious. Every time that phone would ring, I would get this surge of anxiety and I would not want to touch it. But it was part of my job, so I had to do it. Finally, I realized, if I'm going to be doing this all the time, I should probably learn how to get better at it. So I started watching my coworkers, how they interacted with patrons on the phone. And I got plenty of practice myself. And over time, I started to realize I was getting a little bit more confident and a little bit more relaxed when I was talking on the phone. And then I realized this wasn't just on the phone, this was in all sorts of social situations. And about 18 months after starting that public library job, I started my current job at the Central Kansas Library System. And now, instead of just helping patrons with their problems, I was expected to teach library staff how to do their jobs. The first few times that I went out to train on koha, I went with an experienced trainer. And you know what? The first few times, I just stepped back, let them do all the talking, and watched. You got it, right? But I had to start training on my own eventually. And so I still remember how terrified I was. The first few times I walked into that library alone. And you know what? I didn't do a great job at first. I kept learning, and I kept growing. And over time, I've become fairly comfortable with the idea of how to help people learn. And so today, I want to share with you some of the things that I've learned along the way, some of the things I've learned from mentors and from doing research, and I hope you can find some of it helpful for your own work. So let's get started. I did go with the Western theme here, in case you didn't notice. First of all, let's start with what are some of the challenges of training? I'm not going to cover remotely everything, but I want to cover some of the things that I think are important, especially for training with technology. I believe you can turn challenges into opportunities, but you got to know the right way to do that. First of all, what are some of the barriers? As we all know, we had this presentation this morning on AI, and technology is changing faster and faster. And it's really hard to keep up. That alone makes it difficult to train on technology. Secondly, there's a lot of differences between generations. Some people grew up with all this technology and they get pretty comfortable with using it and learning new stuff. You've probably seen a child who picks up a phone and they start using it very quickly. But other people grew up and this is all new to them still. You can refer to them as digital immigrants versus digital natives. And so that can be a challenge, but you know what? That's not the only thing. Stereotypes are a challenge as well. Because sometimes, just because someone is older doesn't mean they're bad at technology. Sometimes they're afraid of living up to this stereotype that they are bad at technology. And so they just don't want to have anything to do with it. One of the best ways to get over all these barriers, in my opinion, is to make a personal connection with whoever you're training. You got to connect with them. And that's even more important in today's world, because if you look at how much we are glued to our technology and how rare it is to have those kinds of connections, it's really important. And it actually helps you to connect, if you can connect as equals, instead of here's the person learning and here's you up here as the trainer. If you can level the playing field so that they feel comfortable with you, then they feel comfortable making mistakes. And making mistakes is an important part of learning. Next, you got to prepare, you got to be ready, and you can't just walk into something. Well, sometimes you have to, but it's best to be prepared. I recommend that you have an outline if you're training with Koha and say, here are all the things that someone needs to know if they're going to use, let's say, the staff client. And then you start from there, and now you have a framework to build your training. There are a couple of questions that can help you prepare for training. And first of all, what's your goal? Think about what your primary objectives are as the teacher and what you want the person who is learning to be able to do. For example, if you're training a staff member who needs to know how to do pretty much everything in the catalog, that's going to look very, very different from if you're training someone who's just going to be running the circulation desk. That is what you could call fluency versus specific knowledge. I recommend that you write down maybe 2 or 3 excellent objectives that you want to accomplish during your training. But that's not the only thing to keep in mind. What's their goal? What are they trying to accomplish? Because if you can find what is motivating them to learn, maybe it's just they're required to as part of their job, but that's still helpful to know. And you can use that motivation to help them learn. We had a library director that we had a lot of trouble with her and technology. And she was constantly calling us with problems with her computer and trying to figure out how to do this with Koha. And one time, our IT guy got a call that she said, I can't use my computer. And he tried to walk her through all this stuff and it wasn't happening. So he drove 2 hours to her library and he found out the mouse wasn't plugged in. And so we just had this, again, this stereotype. She was older and we had this stereotype, oh, she's just not good with technology. And then later on, we found out that she's an accomplished photographer and she is a whiz at Photoshop. Well, obviously she knows how to do technology, but she had motivation to learn that technology, whereas with Koha, she wasn't really motivated to learn. If you can find their motivation, use that to your advantage. What do they need? I'm bad at this. I give way too much information because I like to know stuff, but most people, they just want to know how to do the thing, and that's it. If you overwhelm them with information, they're not going to remember anything. Okay, next. How do you actually do training and make it more effective? Before you start training, when you first meet the person you're going to be working with, you got to make a connection and make a personal connection. Help them feel comfortable around you so that they can make mistakes and not feel judged by you. I really don't like small talk. That's something I'm not good at, but you gotta do it. One of the things that we like to talk about a lot in Kansas is the weather. I don't know if that's the same here. Maybe it's universal, I don't know, but we like to mostly complain about the weather. Hey, if that's your open door, that's great.
You want to encourage an attitude of curiosity. If someone's curious, they're less likely to get frustrated. Maybe they're trying to figure out, oh, I don't know why it's doing that. Next, try to observe them to see where they're at. If you're training on a computer and they sit at the computer, do they look like they're nervous? Do they look like they don't even want to touch the keyboard or the mouse? Or do they just dive right in and say, okay, let's do this? Because again, your training is going to look very different, whether it's someone who doesn't even know how to use a mouse versus someone who can do all sorts of stuff with the computer. That gives you a lot of information. Do they look like they're going to take notes? Then make sure you give them time to take notes and don't rush through things. Okay, I'm going to give you 4 things that I would call training essentials. Number 1, you got to teach them. Don't just walk through the motions and say, you're watching this, right? You got it? You got to come alongside and walk through it with them. Some people don't want to do that. They want to just watch you do it. But you know what? They don't learn much that way. So if they're feeling really hesitant, you can say, okay, why don't you do this on your device, and I will do this on my device, and we can go through it together. Again, the curiosity is incredibly important. And if you model that curiosity, it kind of becomes almost, they catch it as well. If you've got something that is really, really important for them to know, you got to repeat it multiple times. And one of the best ways to do this is, number 1, you will go through it with them, and then you step back, number 2, and say, okay, can you do it without my help? And you watch them do it. If they get stuck, you can help them. And then thirdly, say, okay, pretend I don't know what I'm doing. You teach me how to do this. Once they've gone through it 3 times, they know it really, really well. You don't want to do that with everything. Obviously, that's going to take way too much time. But if there's something that they need to know that's really important, that's a great way to get it in their head. You got to be adaptable. Again, they're different learning levels. Up here versus down here, maybe all you can train them how to do today is check out a book. And that's okay. If that's where they're at, that's what they need to know. Or maybe you can go through reports and you can go through administrative settings. Just be willing and able to adapt to where they're at. It's also helpful to have different format varieties. So if you've got a print tutorial and maybe you've got some recorded videos and you're working with them in person, you can tell them, hey, by the way, here's this print thing, you can take it with you. And if you get stuck, we've got videos, because that helps take some of the pressure off so they don't feel like, I got to get this right now. Make sure you support them as well. Make it a safe environment to try different things and maybe even encourage them to experiment. Say, hey, what do you think would happen if you click this button? Be careful which button you choose for that. Make sure it's fun and rewarding. We think about that a lot with kids, making it fun, but you know what? It works for adults too. And in fact, I've got candy for everyone. So I'm going to start it here with Bob, if you pass it down. I hope that helps keep you awake after lunch, if nothing else. One of the best ways to support them is to show empathy and to bring yourself down to the level. I like to tell them things like, you know what? There's nothing that you can do, nothing you can break that we can't fix. I'm looking at the Bywater folks because I don't know if that's 100% accurate. But so far, it hasn't steered us wrong. Something else you can do is tell them a story of when you messed up, because they may think, oh, this is the tech guru, they know what they're doing. But if you can tell a time when you messed up, that helps to bring you down to their level. This is not something, so something that happened specifically at our organization a couple of years ago is somebody was playing around with the batch patron anonymization tool, and they deleted all 60,000 patrons in our catalog. That was an exciting time. But you know what? We got them back. It was a chaotic couple of days, but we were able to get the patrons back. And if you can tell them, look, we who should know what we're doing, we did this, we broke it in a really big way, and we were still able to recover, that helps them a lot. You don't have to tell them that every November the 13th, you have a silent day of vigil to remember the great patron deletion. And keep communicating with them as you're training. Keep talking to them. How many of you have ever called customer service on the phone and you ask them a question, they say, hang on a minute, and they put you on hold. And you sit there and you sit there and you sit there listening to the music that might be amazing, it might be terrible, and you have no idea what's going on. So this is incredibly important, especially if you're doing video or phone training, but even in person. If you've got to do something for a few minutes, look something up, make sure you tell them, hey, by the way, I'm going to be doing this for a few minutes, hang tight. And if it's taking you longer than expected, just check in with them. Say, by the way, I'm still working on this. I'm so glad you're still here. Make sure you conclude well. Once you're finished training, I like to ask them a couple of questions. Number one, have I fully answered all of your questions today? And number two, I didn't write this one down. But make sure you check in with them to make sure that they are fully prepared to step out of the training and they feel confident in what they're doing. Next, I want to give a couple of notes about accessibility because that's really important. This is going to be a bit more technical. I'm going to cover some technical things, and it's going to be divided into different types of training formats. First of all, for in-person training, make sure you're choosy about your location. Make sure it's accessible, so you don't want someone going up 3 flights of stairs and in the back to reach the training area. But you also don't necessarily want them to be in a really public space where they might not feel comfortable asking questions or making mistakes. So if you can find something that's a bit out of the way, but it's still easy to do, that's perfect. Make sure it's got good lighting. That way they can see your face, because sometimes people need to see your face and read your lips in order to understand what's going on. And try to steer away from distractions, especially noise. Next, keep in mind that you want to have some ways to help them visually. It's great to have handouts that are large and clear, maybe bigger, slightly bigger print than you would expect or that you would use yourself. Make sure you show them and don't just tell them. Again, that's that coming alongside and working through things together. And again, having handouts is very helpful. And you might be starting to see a theme here. You got to communicate with them. Be a bit more expressive, maybe. If it seems like they're having trouble hearing you, be a bit more expressive with your face, with your gestures, and make sure you are making eye contact as you're talking, and you're not just turning to the side and talking like this, and they can't understand what's going on. Make sure you leave lots of space for questions and for them to process things that they're hearing. What about video training? If you're doing recording or live video trainings, how do you make sure that's more accessible? Well, the obvious one, right, is to make sure that you've got really good video resolution. With most cameras and phones today, that's not going to be an issue at all. But make sure you check that, especially if you're sharing your screen and it's recording. Make sure it's clear enough that they can see what's actually happening on the screen. Make sure the camera angles and the lighting is good. So again, so that they can see your face and they're not looking up your nose or anything like that. Make sure it's in focus, because some cameras don't autofocus and you might see the great picture behind you, but not you. Secondly, how about visual things? I did some research and it turns out actually between 50 to 80% of people really prefer having subtitles on their videos. It's not just people who maybe can't hear very well, it's a lot of people. And so it's really important, especially for the shorter videos, to have those subtitles. Something that I like to use to help save time is otter.ai. It's a transcription app. And so it transcribes what you're saying, but then it uses AI to kind of interpret and hopefully fix some of those words that sometimes transcription apps get wrong. You still have to go through and make sure things are correct, but it helps a lot. Also, if you're showing a screen, make sure your cursor is nice and big. If you've got a tiny cursor, they can't see anywhere that you're clicking. So increase the size, make it unusually large, and make sure it's got a bit more contrast. Finally, this is the one that I think is the most overlooked when you're doing video training. Audio is absolutely essential. If someone can't hear you very well, or the audio is really off or garbled, they're probably not going to watch your video and they might not learn anything. So I would suggest having a decent mic. One that's close to your face is the best. So if you've got those earbuds with a microphone right here, or if you've got a headset that's got a mic right here, in my opinion, that's the best. Don't use your laptop mic. It usually doesn't work very well. And you can clean it up even further. So there's something I like to use that's called Adobe Podcast. And there's the address right there, podcast.adobe.com/enhance. And you can actually use it for free for limited, I think it's 30 minutes per day of audio. And if you put it in there, it actually goes through and it cleans up the audio and it makes it much clearer. You do have to have a little bit of video editing knowledge for this because you have to extract the audio out and upload it and then put it back in the video. But it's not super difficult to do once you learn it. What about print tutorials? Please don't use Comic Sans. I'm sorry. I'm a designer and I hate Comic Sans. But just make sure it's a simple font and it's readable. And again, probably bump it up a little bit larger than what you might expect normally. If you're using colors, especially different colored text on the colored background, make sure that the contrast is good. There's lots of web tools like webaim.org that have contrast checkers where you can put in the text color and the background color, and it makes sure that this is accessible. And it even adjusts depending on what size the text is. You also don't want to rely only on colors to give information. And what I mean by that is if you print this in black and white or grayscale, does it mean the same thing as when you print it in color? Finally, the layout. Don't just have this wall of text that's all it is. Make sure there's room to breathe, lots of white space. Make sure you break it up with images to help explain things. And if you're using headers or subheaders, make sure it's clear where those are and what they are. Okay, sometimes it feels like that, doesn't it? What are some ways that you can deal with problems that often come up while you're training? What if somebody is just really confused? They just act like, I don't know what's going on, and just take a second, take a deep breath, and see if you can explain it in a different way. Maybe take a different approach. So if someone's having trouble understanding the patron catalog, you could say, well, have you used a card catalog before? And if they have, you would say, great, let's explain it in that way. On the other hand, maybe they haven't used a card catalog, but have you ever shopped on Amazon? Have you shopped on eBay? Okay, let's go from this direction. And then you can start to ask questions and to find out where exactly they started to get confused. Because where they are confused and where you think they are might not always be the same place. They might be 5 minutes behind you and they are still trying to figure that out. And then break things down into smaller steps. So once you've figured out where they are and what's confusing them, break it down one by one and say, okay, let's go through this one step at a time and find out where the problem is. What about the dreaded situation where somebody asks a question and you don't know the answer? You gotta be honest. Don't just make up an answer and pretend you know what you're talking about. Say, I'm not really sure, but don't leave it there. You know how frustrating it is when you call someone on the phone and you ask a question, they say, I don't know, and they don't do anything with it. So one of the things you can do is you can kind of try to bring this curiosity mindset in, and you can say, you know what, I don't know, but let's find out together. and you start to go through and see if you can find the answer, whether you're just playing around with Koha or you're looking it up online. And encourage them to experiment on their own, because eventually you don't want to be holding their hand forever. And so you want to try and coax them into this mindset where they think, okay, I can find this out myself too. I can play around with this, and I can look up tutorials. I got this. And that way you can send them off into the sunset eventually. What about when somebody's getting really frustrated? Maybe you're getting frustrated. First of all, I would suggest actually calling it out in some ways by saying, okay, I can see you're getting frustrated. Why don't we take a deep breath and let's step back from this. And you could even say something like, I know learning something new can be frustrating sometimes. And then if you've got a story of when you were frustrated, this is a perfect time to share it. Because again, that strengthens that connection. See if you can reframe things, maybe instead of just being frustrated about something and they think they're running up against a roadblock, see if you can maybe get around it, again, by asking questions. And sometimes you just got to take a break, whether it's for the day or even for 5 minutes, or even just going on to something different. Finally, what if someone is just really scared? They don't want to mess this up and they don't want to touch the computer. First of all, give them easy wins. After you've worked with them for a bit, you may have a good idea of, okay, maybe they can't get this yet, but I bet they could do this, and start walking them through it. And if they can do it, you can say, awesome. And when you build those easy wins on top of each other, suddenly they're starting to get a bit more confident and they might be willing to experiment a bit. Something that my boss, Gail, likes to do when she's training someone is, if they're getting stuck, she will have them sitting at the computer. She will step away and turn her back and say, okay, I'm going to walk you through this. Let's say I'm going to check out a book and I'm going to show you where to go. I'm going to tell you where to go and how to do it. This does a few things. First of all, they gain a lot of confidence in you as a trainer because you know exactly what's going on, even if you're not watching the screen. It helps them gain confidence in doing things on their own, and it removes some of that pressure of someone watching them doing things. We had a presentation earlier this year by Kieran Hickson from the Colorado State Library, and he presented for us at CKLS. And he shared this in his presentation, and I loved it. And so I wanted to share it here. These are the spirals of learning. So we've got our downward spiral, and we've got our upward spiral. You might notice something interesting. Uncertainty and confusion start the downward spiral. Uncertainty and befuddlement, which is another word for confusion, starts the upward spiral. And so if someone's getting frustrated or confused, that's not a bad thing. That's simply a normal part of learning. Where they actually start to diverge is right there on the third one. There is frustration versus curiosity. That's where things start to separate a bit. And so that's why I've been talking about this curiosity mindset, because if you can find a way when someone is frustrated to flip that around and turn that into curiosity instead, suddenly you're going upward instead of downward. And if a patron comes to you with a question or a problem, where are they on here? They're usually at least to the frustrated stage, if not much further down, right? And so keep that in mind and see if there's a way to flip that. It's not always easy to know how to do that, but connecting with them, asking questions, and modeling it yourself is a great start. You also want to encourage them to make mistakes because, again, frustration is a part of learning. And there is one thing on here, on this downward spiral, that I think is really important and really telling. One word that probably drives the entire thing, right there, self-doubt. If someone's not doing well and they're getting frustrated, this is probably not about you as a trainer or about the technology. This is because they feel like this is a reflection on them as a person. I'm not smart. I can't figure this out. I'm too old for this. I'm too young for this. This is too complicated for me. And so once you understand that, again, making that connection, putting yourself on their level, if you can tell stories of when you were in trouble and you messed up, it helps them to get out of that downward spiral of feeling like this is making me look like I'm really stupid, and to get out of that into the upward spiral. So trying to figure out where they are on this spiral when you're training them and you're running into a problem, that gives you a clue as to how you need to proceed in order to flip it around. But what about you? Where are you as a trainer? Sometimes it's you getting frustrated and not them. So you got to be mindful of that and be aware of where you're at. So I'm actually starting to shift a little bit from, instead of talking about just the people you're training, what about you as a trainer? I'm a huge believer in the idea that you can continue to improve and to grow constantly, and that's essential. That's an essential part of being human, really. So here are some things that I found that have been helpful to me in order to grow and improve. Number one, after doing a training, just start writing things down. I call it the brain dump, where you just get everything out of your head and write down things that went well, things that didn't go well, things you wish you would have done, things that you want to try next time. Reflective learning, and by that I mean learning by reflecting on your own experiences or the experiences of other people. So if you've had, let's say, a great customer service interaction, see if you can think back and say, okay, what were the things that they did that helped make this a great interaction? Or if you had a horrible experience, what did they do that made this a really negative experience? And I know a lot of us get caught in this comparison trap where we look at someone else and you think, oh, they're doing such a great job at this, and I'm just not that good. Use that to your advantage. Because if you can step out of that critical mode and into a curious mode, you can start to say, okay, wait a minute. Anybody can do this. They're doing certain things, specific things that maybe I don't know how to do yet. What are 2 or 3 things that they're doing that I can integrate into my learning and my training? Replace your criticism of yourself or of others with curiosity. Having guidance is incredibly helpful as well. If you can find someone who's a mentor or who can teach you different things and go along with you, that's very helpful. And then getting feedback. You want someone who's going to be honest with you. You don't want someone who's just going to tell you what they think you want to hear. Oh yeah, you did a great job. It was perfect. Probably not. But you do want someone who's kind and who believes in you and who cares about you as a person, so that they can give you constructive feedback so you can continue to grow. And finally, you got to take action. You can get all this stuff in your head and think, oh, I'm going to be a great trainer. But if you don't step into the ring and practice, you don't really get anywhere. Because just like it is with patrons, for you, every time you fail or make a mistake is an opportunity to learn. You're probably not going to destroy the world because you didn't have a great training. So keep things in perspective and say, okay, I'll do this better next time. This is an image that I really love. Failure is not missing the mark. Failure is never even trying. Okay, so I will close in just a minute, but before I do, I want to see if any of you have any questions or comments.
I hate to admit this, but like you mentioned making the cursor bigger when you're doing videos. What's the easiest way to do that?
So I use a Mac and I go into the settings and you can just search for cursor size, but usually it's under accessibility settings.
Okay. I also
Do you have a good product or way for, like, if you're making a video, subtitles on the video? Like, we use Microsoft Stream. But I don't think and I know it's like TikTok makes it real easy to put the subtitles in there, you know? Is there another?
We use YouTube for our training videos, and
Okay.
YouTube has auto-generated captions, which are usually not that great.
Yeah,
But if you go into the settings when you're uploading a video, you can actually upload your own text. So if you just have a block of text,
yeah.
and then YouTube automatically syncs it to the words.
People online would like the microphone.
I Googled that and it looks like it can have subtitles in Microsoft Stream.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Michael, amazing job, and I think that I look back at, I remember another Koha, and we asked you to join us on Monday Minutes, and you're like, I'm not ready for that. So like, look at you now, like this
No
is
pressure.
amazing, amazing. And I think a lot of what you said resonated with me, as I was a former educator with Bywater, and it's really important, and I think from my perspective, you really hit a lot of great things, and I wish you taught me that before I did my job, because I could have learned a lot faster. But I think that one thing that I took away is I just thought I needed to know everything, and it's really your attitude and your kind of way to evolve or kind of pivot from our last Koha conference, pivot with that idea that it's gonna be okay that you don't know the answer, but it's how you kind of handle that information. I spent a lot of time trying to cram everything about Koha into my head when really it was okay to say, I don't know, but let's press the button and let's do that. So, but great job, Michael.
Thank you.
Good job, Michael. I train at my library, and you've actually already taught me some things. Some of the things that you do, I already do. A lot of times you can fix things they break. Sometimes it takes a long time. Trust me on this. I will tell you this story sometime. But I have to say that you did teach me, and thank you, because the reframing the thoughts, the taking a break, those things. We get a lot of older people that can't do the Libby, or they think they can't do the Libby. They can usually do it once you talk them through it, but they get so frustrated. But I liked the reframing of the thoughts, and I just wanted to say thank you, because you've taught me, and I'm one that teaches others, so thank you for that. That was very good.
Thank you.
Hey, I just want to add in, I mean, this is incredibly amazing. The only thing I would add is the fact that the way that you troubleshoot, the way that you approach broken things sets the stage for how they're going to receive your training. And I think what you said is like, it's amazing when you realize that, oh, if I'm grumpy when they say, why does this work this way? And they're not going to be amenable to my training. So kind of thinking that if that's all of the piece, that the way that you troubleshoot, the way that you answer the phone, the way that you say, like, you did what now, is like, and then the day that you're their trainer, they're gonna have that, you did what now, in their heads. And so it's all the same. Troubleshooting is the same as training.
That's a great point. Thank you. Something that I learned from my boss is when the phone rings and you answer the phone, if you're sitting at your computer, actually turn your chair away from your computer, because people can actually hear the difference in your voice when you're looking at your computer versus when you're completely focused on what they're saying. Yep.
Do you have any suggestions for when you are training someone who seems like they just don't want to be trained, or they don't want to learn what you're trying to teach them?
Well, you can't force someone to learn if they don't want to learn. But I think if you can go back to finding something that motivates them, if you can find a motivation, then that can be a key. And sometimes you have to dig quite a ways, but if you can find something you have in common and then go from there, that can sometimes be your way in.
There's only one online comment from Carolyn in Libro, and she says, very interesting. Also, I 100% agree with you on Comic Sans.
And papyrus. Okay, well, as I close, I want you to know that although you might not feel comfortable or you might feel nervous about training people, it doesn't have to stop you from being great. You will make mistakes, but you don't have to be perfect. That's okay. You'll learn as you go. And, you know, I went from being someone who could barely answer the telephone to here, doing a presentation at conference. I didn't do anything magical. I kept learning. I stayed curious. And I was willing to step outside of my comfort zone a little bit at a time. And you can do the same thing. And your patrons can do the same thing. It's all part of the learning process. Maybe you're going to work with a patron who has this attitude of, I can't do this. I just can't do this. Maybe you've been there yourself or you're there right now. And I think you can change the meaning of that entire phrase by adding a single word. Yet. I can't do this. Yet. I can't do this yet. I can't do this yet. And if you are able to embrace that in your own life and to apply that to what you're doing, it's so much easier to help your patrons embrace that mindset as well. And again, it's all about that connection. And you know what? Koha is all about connection. It's been about community from the beginning, and it's in the name. And you know what? This conference is evidence of that. And so let's continue to move forward and learn and grow together. Thank you.